Melissa was going to come a few months ago, and maybe you'll get into why that didn't quite turn out. But when she released this book called Crossings, and has the most interesting subtitle, "A Bald Asian American Latter-day Saint Woman Scholar's Ventures Through Life, Death, Cancer, and Motherhood, Not Necessarily in That Order," which is a great subtitle, but there's a lot of layers in the title, in the main title of the book, Crossings, and I'm sure maybe you'll give us some insights into that. I think one of the ideas behind this Wider Circles group is we're going to see other ways other ways to be Latter-day Saint than maybe we're familiar with, and I think Melissa exemplifies something. It's just the most interesting life, and I'm going to resist the temptation to talk about it because I've asked Uncle Charles to give that introduction. And turning the tables, I'm going to let Melissa introduce Uncle Charles, and I'm just going to get out of the way. We have two remarkable lives, two remarkable people, and we're so happy that you've agreed to come share some time with us. So, turn it over to Melissa and Charles Inouye.
So I'm just going to start reading a little section, which actually in a way introduces Uncle Charles. So, is it okay if I stand up? I'm afraid that I'm not loud enough. Is that okay, Craig? So this is an excerpt from a book when I was talking about my high school questions, and I was asking, is the church true? Are its teachings correct? So to my high school self, these questions were important and also terrifying, because the validity of so many other things seemed to hinge on these questions. I knew I'd have to figure this out, but at the same time I didn't want to. I feared there was a zero-sum contest between my religious truth and everyone else's truth. What if the church lost? And then what could I believe and who would I be? For help, I turned to my crazy Uncle Charles, as he called himself, my dad's little brother, a Stanford and Harvard-educated professor of Japanese literature at Tufts University. I told him my doubts about Latter-day Saint claims. I wrote very long emails. He called them Melissa's Maramails, asking these questions. What about evolution? What about blacks in the priesthood? What about polygamy? What about Joseph Smith saying there were 5-foot-high Quakers living on the moon? Uncle Charles replied that long ago when he was an undergraduate, he too had had doubts. He had gone to another Latter-day Saint professor for help. This professor had said, there are a lot of stories in the world, but Mormonism is a story that I want to be true. Uncle Charles concluded his message to me with the statement, there are a lot of stories in the world, but the Mormon story is the one I want to be true. To the extent that it is not, I will make it true. Now at the time I read this as a sort of well-meaning self-deception, kind of like the Santa Claus story. Santa Claus doesn't really exist, but for kids who believe in Santa Claus, he does. Wow! He flies around the sky in a sleigh drawn by reindeer. He fits down the chimney and magically leaves presents with tags signed in parents' handwriting. That's great for, say, 5-year-olds. But for everyone else, and for those 5-year-olds whose parents have let them in on the secret, it's just another tender falsehood. So to say something like, to the extent that it is not, I will make it true, sounded foolish and also a little arrogant. You can't make a religion true in the same way that you can pull off the Santa Claus Act. There had to be a right answer that was definitely and completely right. Despite this ambivalence, I was ultimately comforted by Uncle Charles's endorsement, incomplete as it seemed at the time. Maybe there were some things about religion that weren't clear to me at the moment, but Uncle Charles was pretty smart. And here I'm pausing from the book and to say that the last thing about introducing Uncle Charles is probably the reason why I'm a Latter-day Saint today is because Uncle Charles helped me see a way to be a Latter-day Saint, having the questions that I had and thinking the thoughts that I did. I trusted him. And then because I trusted him, I kept on looking. Thanks, Uncle Charles. So later on, I did a PhD. I researched Asian religions and lots of histories of religions. And I didn't see anything exceptionally problematic about the Latter-day Saint tradition. Although I knew that many in my church had been terribly disillusioned by historic or contemporary blemishes in the church's institutional structures and people. I found big problems in all of the world's traditions and theologies and histories and all of those things that I studied everywhere. But with regard to these things that trouble people about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, some might say, Joseph Smith lied to his rank-and-file followers, and most importantly to his wife Emma, about his practice of polygamy. Therefore, he wasn't a prophet, and therefore the religion that he founded is all bogus. Or others might say, the church's structure is patriarchal, and patriarchy is oppressive to women. Therefore, the patriarchs are not called of God, and the church is all bogus. There was a time in my life when I would have thought about religion in the same uncompromisingly syllogistic way, as if a religious system were a stream of cheap Christmas tree lights. If one light broke, the whole string was out. And that's how I felt when, as a high school student, I asked Uncle Charles, is the church true? Are his teachings correct? In my mind, just one flaw, such as a teaching attributed to Joseph Smith, the moon was inhabited by short people dressed like Quakers, could set off the whole chain reaction that ended up with my faith being bogus. To me at the time, Uncle Charles's response was small comfort. To the extent that the church is not true, I will make it true. If something is bogus, I thought, how can you do anything to make it true? This faith-unraveling syllogism, that is, Joseph Smith was a fraud, therefore the religion he founded is bogus, therefore one's entire faith as a Latter-day Saint is bogus, is actually just the reverse of a faith-promoting syllogism often circulated at church on Sunday. If the Book of Mormon is true, the syllogism goes, then everything Joseph Smith did or said was divinely inspired. If Joseph Smith was divinely inspired in everything, then everything about the church is just how God wants it. I now have a different perspective on this issue of religious claims. Both Christmas tree light syllogisms, the faith unraveling and the faith promoting, are flawed. They demand that light leap from one point to another along a single string of connections. They argue if one junction along the string is flawed, then the whole string is dysfunctional, or if the whole string is functional, then every single junction must be perfect. But instead of a string of Christmas tree lights, perhaps a better metaphor for I see the church now is a sourdough starter, which I sometimes use to bake our family's bread. Artisan sourdough with a reddish golden crust that crackles and a creamy interior with large irregular holes and complex flavors doesn't just happen. Enzymes break apart large tasteless starch molecules so wild yeast can unlock sugars and create bubbles of carbon dioxide that stretch strands of gluten. And strains of bacteria are also fighting in the starter for dominance, and they create this acidic environment. So all of this is a process of fermentation, what we usually call food going bad. It begins with the starter, a colony of wild yeast and bacteria in a starchy soup. There's nothing pure about sourdough starter. It's stinky, it smells a little off, but when you introduce it into a properly balanced supply of flour, water, and salt, the starter is a catalyst for producing a complex set of interactions that make heavenly bread. Religious traditions are like artisan sourdough. They're complex, living things, both organization and organism, created and sustained by many processes and actors, shaped by time and their environment. They can be naturally subject to corruption, and yet they are also susceptible through the same process of leavening to producing goodness. Doctrinal teaching is important, but I don't think any story we try to tell about God can be complete as a truth in itself. To me, the way truths become manifest in lived experience is a more valid measure of what is real or divine. Who cares about whether something is true by any abstract measure, including intellectual and theological argument, if it cannot be realized in our daily work, our bodies, or most importantly, relationships with fellow beings? In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said that what people did was more important than what people said, and that people could be known by their fruits. So maybe when Uncle Charles said, I will make it true, he was simply making the effort required to exercise faith, to swim within the starchy soup, and let natural processes work over time. Perhaps he was also speaking of Latter-day Saints' responsibility to exercise initiative in addition to faith, to do our part to bring our culture and everyday practices into harmony with our highest beliefs and values, to doggedly keep our covenants to follow Christ and be known as his people. So now we have Uncle Charles. Was that what you meant? And if not, what would you say?
That's pretty close. Pretty close. So I wrote something in response to what I knew Melissa was going to ask me, and I entitled it Immigrant Pie in People We Trust. My Japanese-American parents rarely talked about what happened to them during the war, how they were forced to leave their homes and live in a concentration camp in Wyoming for 3 years. But my father once broke the silence. We were sitting on the concrete floor of the farm shop, our lunch pails open before us. My mother usually put in 2 sandwiches, a bag of chips,
Charles, could you speak
a piece of fruit or cookies. Is that better? We were quietly eating when my father suddenly said, "What the war taught me is that you can't trust people. You can only trust ideas." Not much discussion followed. Being the youngest of 4 sons, I didn't ask any questions. But I have spent the rest of my life thinking about what he said that day, some 50 years ago. I've been wondering if my father was wrong. Isn't it the other way around? Shouldn't it be, we can trust people, not ideas? Aren't ideas what make people dangerous? We can talk about primitive instincts, emotional reactions, the need for principles, and so on. But to my mind, there is nothing so dangerous as the big ideas that evoke massive responses. For example, at one point in time, millions of people thought it was good to kill millions of other people. The Japanese shared this idea, so did Germans and Americans. The result was World War II, where the object was not to destroy the enemy's soldiers, but rather to eliminate the enemy altogether. Embracing such ideology, modern people tended to be patriotic. In the case of the United States, patriotism affirmed America as the home of the free and the brave. We, the people, have certain rights. We Americans love this idea. Speaking for myself, I know the beauty of America. I love the eroded plateaus of Utah and the damp forests of New England, where I now live. I am fond of the place the Chinese call Meiguo, beautiful country, and the Japanese call Beikoku, rice country. To them, America is an idea, but to me, it's a place. Ideas are problematic. If America is beautiful, why were my parents loaded into trains and sent to live in horse stalls at Santa Anita Racetrack? Why were they then transported to Heart Mountain, where they endured snowy winters and dusty summers, surrounded by barbed wire and soldiers with rifles? Like the idea of beautiful America, supposed racial inferiority and political disloyalty of my family was also an idea. The second idea overwhelmed the first one. The two morphed into a third, that some citizens of the United States deserve freedom and happiness and others don't. In principle, my parents had certain rights, but the idea of beautiful America did not protect them. In fact, the patriotism of others led to their imprisonment. In the world of lived ideas, no one spoke up. No one was enough of a person to resist the impulse to lock them up. So that is what happened. Men like President Franklin D. Roosevelt and General John DeWitt made the decision to send the Japanese back to where they came from, or to lock up those who did not leave. Social scientists have studied this shameful event in American history. Xenophobia, economic competition, the William Randolph Hearst newspapers, racism, all contributed. Apparently, there were a few sympathetic people on the East Coast who demonstrated against President Roosevelt's executive order to relocate the Japanese on the West Coast. But Congress did not resist, neither did the Supreme Court. The majority of Americans let the imprisonment of over 100,000 people happen right before their eyes. If they knew it was a bad idea, the majority didn't care enough to stop it. the bad idea was allowed to annul a good idea that all people deserve life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Perhaps a bad idea winning out over a good one doesn't mean that freedom and happiness are null and void. But what use is the idea of freedom if people are not free? What good is the idea of happiness if people are not living happily? This brings me to the other half of my father's statement, that you can't trust people. Is this really true? For the Inouye family, one consequence of the war and the relocation was most unexpected. After Heart Mountain, my parents moved to a small community in south central Utah. We lived in a farmhouse. Johnny Jorgensen, his wife, and dog lived a mile away. The town of Sigurd, population 200, was another 2 miles away. There, in a largely forgotten part of the world, we found refuge among the Latter-day Saints who, like us, had also been persecuted and driven from their homes. The Mormons, so-called, fled from mobs in Missouri and Illinois. They crossed the plains to settle in the mountains of the valleys. By contrast, we had been sent east, away from California and Washington, ending up in the same place. With the Latter-day Saints, we lived side by side. My father minded his business. He became a farmer. He worked hard, with great effort. He tried to prove that the idea that imprisoned him was false, and the one that set him free was true. He eventually became successful, but he was never fully healed of his trauma, at least not until the very end of his life. Just before he died, my father told me that he thought God's hand had led our family from the West Coast to Utah. I was surprised to hear this. The bitter man who graduated from Stanford in the 30s, who couldn't find a job in America, who sought employment in Japan and gave up on that idea, who started his own business in the Bay Area and lost everything to the relocation, this man who chose the isolation of the Utah countryside over going back to Palo Alto, he told me many times that he was not a man of faith. Speaking about our LDS neighbors, he would say, "I just don't have what they have." In short, he found it hard to live certain ideas in the way our neighbors did. In the end, though, even he came to embrace the Latter-day Saint reality of God as a person who cares for everyone. In short, it wasn't the idea of liberty that freed my father from his anguish. Rather, it was the actual kindness of the people that set him free. Originally, my parents were Buddhist. Wanting their children to receive some kind of spiritual training, they sent us to the LDS Church in Sigurd and later in Gunnison. They never thought we would take to this rather odd form of Christianity. Members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are odd in the sense that we, like Mahayana Buddhists, believe in eternal progression or the ability of people and other sentient beings to become God-like. Perhaps my parents noted the common resonance and were comforted by it. I myself have long since left the isolation of southern Utah for the more diverse community of Boston, Massachusetts. Given my present perspective as a first-generation New Englander, one thing about having grown up in Sigurd and Gunnison stands out as miraculous. None of the people I grew up with were hateful towards me because I was one of a few non-white people in our community. None of them. I trusted them. They believed in me. To them, I am eternally grateful. They gave me hope in a world of many bad ideas. This is not to say they were perfect people, ideologically or otherwise. And I would be quick to distinguish them from Latter-day Saints in northern Utah, so excuse me for saying this, which is the greener, more prosperous part of the state. A young bishop in Salt Lake City told my cousin Jeanette that she was not welcome to buy a house in their neighborhood. Her experience of the church did not progress much beyond the idea that she formed of it at that time. Growing up in southern Utah, I did not feel the dark idea of racism until much later in life. Looking back at my childhood, I believe it was our shared poverty, the humble state of being left behind, that helped us learn to love each other. Ron Carter, Meredith Snedeker, Pauline Miller, if she's here. Is she here? She's not here. Richard Dyring, Bruce Christensen, David Madsen, Nick Anderson, Rex Oliver, Brad Duffin, Kirk Anderson, Bobby Bound, Lane Sorensen, Evelyn Peterson, Jenny Christiansen, Deborah Jensen, Elaine Yardley, Mary Bartholomew. They were and still are my brothers and sisters. To my assertion that they are good people, you might counter the idea that encourages Latter-day Saints to be compassionate exists alongside another idea that tempts them to be judgmental. I concede the point. As I have written in The End of the World, Plan B, an unbalanced emphasis on justice is pervasive today because of its currency as a quintessentially modern idea. Many Latter-day Saints have wanted to be modern, even though it always was and will continue to be a bad fit. My main argument still holds. There are ideas, and then there are ideas. Those worth taking most seriously are grounded in the reality of earth, trees, sun, sky, and water. They are not servants of ideology nor angels of theology. Humanity's best ideas do not allow us to be separated from the reality of things for our need for air, food, water, shelter, and hope. At the level of things, my father's distinction between ideas he wanted to trust, on the one hand, and the living reality of our Latter-day Saint neighbors on the other, eventually broke down. In the end, there was only nothingness, a state of moo, the place of sugar cookies and immigrant pie we call Zion. As for my father's trust in ideas, true principles come alive and grounded in the lives of humble people who see their own spiritual and material poverty as the communal affair that it is, was, and will always be. Whether in Gunnison or Salt Lake City or Boston or Tokyo or Jerusalem, the right place, Zion, is of one mind and heart, where there are no poor, and the stranger is not despised. Does that answer your question?
Well, I'm just thinking about this thing about people. I generally agree with you, I think. But sometimes I think I have so many friends, and I've had I've had mostly really positive experiences in the church. I have friends who have had devastating experiences that have come from people.
Members of the church.
Members of the church. So, can you trust everyone?
No, we can't trust everyone. But there are always people you can trust, I think.
How do you know who can be trusted?
God gives us that intelligence.
Mm.
And sometimes we're disappointed. But sometimes I think, do you agree or not? Sometimes we're just blessed. We're lucky. We run into people who are actually examples of the truth. And we actually can become that person, right? Which is a miracle.
I think, around the world you see people trying to kind of implement what's in the handbook. And the great irony is usually the more closely they try to hew to the letter of the law in the handbook, the more creative they become because they're trying to interpret it within their own cultural context. So the more people try to apply in their everyday lives what's in the handbook, the more interesting forms of church life and practice you get. So I think that the global church holds so much potential, especially as we understand what we look like. Right now, the church has so many different faces and forms, but most of us have only experienced, one or two of those kinds of forms of church culture. But it's so liberating to experience the church in a lot of different contexts and to realize that what you must absolutely do or else be Satan's right-hand person in one ward is totally not an issue in another ward. And it helps you kind of see these different issues. And I think the more the Latter-day Saints can see themselves, the more we'll be disabused of this notion that there's these certain things that we all understand. The more we'll realize that we've made covenants together, and that connects us to each other. But what one Latter-day Saint in Hong Kong understands about the point of the church or the point of the gospel is really different from what someone else like in Auckland might understand. So I think that's really it's really important for us to be able to see ourselves. And I think that's what the work is really encouraging. The work of the Church History Department right now is trying to publish global histories and trying to show the Latter-day Saints each other's experiences so we have a different sense of who we are. We're both, so I think it's really cool, is that our world is both completely contained in a certain sense within our local congregation. What we experience in our local congregation in a certain sense is basically all that Mormonism is. At the same time, these global connections that we have with each other can be really meaningful, and if we take our temple covenants seriously, they're sacred and eternal.
So Melissa, what's the sourdough? What does it look? What does that mix look like? That messy mix look like in different parts of the world where you live? Is that too broad of a question?
Well, I just think generally sourdough just points to the idea that in a certain context it's stinky and corrupt, but if you kind of put it all together, it produces really cool things. And I think that our idea of purity can be detrimental sometimes. This idea that everything has to be pure. There can be no flies in your soup, or
you don't like Wonder Bread?
No cockroaches in your casseroles. I don't know. If I rejected everything because of cockroaches, I would have no food. So, yeah, I just know that people in my wards, for example, where I've lived, have put up with me and my weird ideas and my noisy children, and they've taught my kids how to want to be good, which is the most amazing gift that you can give anyone's child. So I just don't, and I know how flawed I am, corrupted and stinky as well. So I just feel like we can be gracious to one another, and when things are rotten, we can, as I say in another essay in my book, we can call rotten things rotten, and we can call good things good. And I think they're both part of reality.
Can something be rotten and good at the same time?
Well, natto which is a Japanese food that I will not touch. My Uncle Charles likes. It's fermented soybeans. It smells like garbage. It's very slimy. He loves it.
Delicious. What does that have to do with me? When I grew up in Gunnison, people used to always say, I believe that our church is the only true church. And it always bothered me, you know. For different reasons. Logically, it was a difficult statement to make, you know, and to prove. But on the other hand, I appreciate the sentiment that people think that our faith is true. You know, it's what God has for us. And I believe that myself, right? But what I never have appreciated is this kind of chauvinistic version of things that I don't think Jesus intended for us to have that kind of a view of things. I really think it's a modern corruption. So I wrote this book about the end of the world, which is a big part of Latter-day Saint theology, you know. And my point is simply that whenever the concept is taught, it's taught in order to emphasize the compassion that we should have for people. But what we think of it now is as a sort of a judgmental moment where bad people get what they deserve, sort of apocalyptical. Apocalypse actually means the revelation of truth, but now for us mostly it means everybody gets shot. But that, you know, justice is like food. We need it to live, but too much of it's going to kill us, and it's killing us now. Our culture of justice. And it's a modern kind of thing, I think. We need to talk more.
No, this is very interesting. Love you.
Melissa, so would you care to share maybe just a hint? We've got maybe have another 5-10 minutes here, but would you mind sharing why you called your book Crossings? And just so I want to first of all, can I give just a little bit of a description of your book, because your book is as idiosyncratic as you are. It's the most wonderful and strange book that I've read.
Kind of random. It's such a very kind.
It's kind of random. It's like it's also it's filled with it's filled with a lot of smells, taste, and like experiences of real life with really kind of crazy insights, and these amazing little sketches, these little doodles that you do in the margins I've never seen. So Melissa submitted her book to me. I was one of the reviewers for it, and maybe you can show it. Yeah, in the pages on the margins. See if you've ever seen this before. There's Melissa's little sketches, and she's an amazing artist.
Definitely not. No.
Actually, quite a good artist. But the book itself talks about crossings, and what is that theme? How does that theme brought out in the book? And maybe you could explain that a little bit.
Thanks for that question. So actually, when the book was in the stages of kind of early review, one of the reviewers said, there's just too many things going on. You got to think about one audience and then just tailor everything rigorously to like fit that one audience and what that one audience wants. But I kind of rebelled against that, and I thought, probably people are more than one profile, and people have different kinds of experiences, and I don't want to prune away my personal, well actually this is a pretty selfish reason. So for a purely selfish reason, I wrote this book for my kids. So I'm like not going to prune away the stuff with kids, because I was speaking to them. But then I don't want to prune away the other things like thinking or reporting on things or having different experiences, because it should be possible for those things to be part of one story, because I think they're like part of everyone's story, right? We're not just like the demographic that our credit card companies are keeping on us, right? Like we're lots of different kinds of things, and we're parents and children and aunts and uncles and observers and travelers and all those things. So So this idea of crossings is just kind of an acknowledgement of the different lives that we live, sometimes like all at the same time. The different personas we have, like with my children, I'm like a raging dictatorial demon. But with my students, I'm much more patient. Though I'm kind of perturbed by these distinctions, and when you see them together, it makes you want to be a better parent and maybe a more dictatorial professor. I don't know, but it's just really important to me. I think I notice that when I've had these different experiences, these experiences that make you feel a bit marginal, feel a bit different, feel that you're far away from where you used to be. Those are the times where we have the most growth. Why do missionaries have all these cool experiences when they go far away, wherever it is? Why do what's so moving? I was, completely moved about, some of these recent church videos where they start out with everyone like in different places singing a primary song. I'm like such a sucker for that. I love that. Because as they cross over these really different, places, geographical places, they show the Latter-day Saints. And maybe Uncle Charles would say that, those kinds of devices are ways of making everyone think that they're all the same, which, even when they're really different, which is true. But at the same time, you see that difference, and you recognize that those are actual people. And having lived in a lot of different places, you realize that anywhere in the world is just a place where people live, and they aren't that different from each other. So I just think we learn so much, and that when we kind of consciously try to push ourselves to those margins, we have the most growth and we do the most good.
Your ancestors crossed here, you crossed back for a mission, then you crossed back here, then you went back again, then you went to New Zealand. You've had all these like trans-oceanic crossings in your life.
It's so horrible when you have a lot of books. It's super expensive. Yeah.
So Melissa, I loved your Christmas lights analogy with the old lights and the one bulb going out. And so often we're, from such a young age, taught to build up our faith of, like you said, this was true, therefore this, therefore this. And when one of those dominoes falls, there's a ripple effect. So if you had someone come to you and say, this light bulb is out now, what would your advice be? Much like your question to your uncle, what path forward, or what might you offer them to keep the lights on?
Well, I say that in another essay in the book called Rotten Things Rotten, Good Things Good. Someone did come to me, she was a young woman, and she kind of laid out all the things that she thought were so wrong and unfair and even unchristlike that she had experienced in the church. And I think that she was right to be angry and hurt about the kinds of experiences that she'd had and the kinds of systematic problems that she saw. But you can also, I think we can acknowledge those things, but then also acknowledge the things that are really, really valuable to us. So when I was a returned missionary, like I was 22 or something like that, and I was having more questions, and I asked Laurel Ulrich and Claudia Bushman, who again were really smart people who were still Latter-day Saints, and I said, what do you do? And why are you here? There's lots of places where you could believe in Jesus or worship God. Why do you choose to do so within this church? And they said, because I value the church, and it's my church too. And it meant a lot to me that people like Claudia Bushman and Laurel Ulrich valued the church. That, I guess it's the same thing that Uncle Charles said. Uncle Charles was clearly a smart person. Clearly saw a lot of things, but was still here. So sometimes you can acknowledge, I acknowledge the problems that people see, because it would be silly to suggest that we don't have problems. Every large organization has problems. Anything made up of people will have problems, because we're very problematic. But you can, I just say, clearly I value the church because I'm here. And I think that actually, it meant a lot to me when people said that to me. Yes?
I'm not sure if I'm allowed to ask a question, but this is exciting story. And when I taught the Missionary Training Center, we told the missionaries to build this exciting story of, the apostasy, there were no true churches, then boom, God appears, truth restored, it's the one true church, the only thing, the only church that has all the truth, and then there's the Book of Mormon, which is a miracle, there's no other explanation for it, it's a keystone of our religion, and it couldn't have come out without God's word. There's this exciting story, angels are appearing, priest is restored, and it gets people jazzed up that it's an exciting story. And I'm wondering if in moving to like a postmodern version of that, if we lose some of that excitement in terms of, yeah, it's a good church, but what makes it good isn't a God restoring the one true church, but it's the fact that everyone's working really hard and being nice to each other. It sounds like Unitarians, and there's nothing less exciting than being a Unitarian, because Unitarian hymns are like, let's all build a cooperative society and help each other and unite. When we read, when you go to Unitarian service, it's all about just being a good person, not about this miraculous God that turns water into wine and raises people from the dead. It's a boring, bureaucratic, be nice to each other kind of God. Are Mormons moving in that direction if we, because the story of the restoration is itself problematic, because you're like, well, maybe Joseph Smith was a bad guy, so everything falls down, so you abandon that, but if you abandon that, are you become a Unitarian?
I'm going to refer that question to Uncle Charles.
So will we become boring? Is that what you're
Do you lose anything? Sort of inoculating youth, saying
It's about vitality, really. That our narrative, which I actually, I believe in, that makes my faith vital. And I think if I had to just say it was another story, postmoderns would say, oh, it's just another story. It's a great story, but it's one story of many stories. That would, Joseph, would there be vitality in that?
Yeah, that's the question.
Okay. You asked for it. So here's my version of the answer. I can barely, when they ask me once in a while to say the sacrament prayer, I can barely say it. And the reason I have to struggle to get to the end of it is because I now understand what it means. I have the same problem when I look at a plant. I can barely stand it. And the reason I can barely stand it is because I have come to a very different understanding of what a plant is. And I can say the same with rocks, I can say the same with people, and so on. And to a modern point of view, that might seem deadly boring. But as I say, in other ways, the genius of our faith is the genius of Zen Buddhism, which is what the Zen Buddhists did was they took all these big ideas and they pushed them down into the reality of things. So you can become enlightened by arranging flowers, or doing judo, or doing kendo, or doing anything really, right? And I think that kind of grounded material happiness is different from the conceptual, ideological, big happiness. I call it small happiness. That has been, our cocaine for so many years. But, you grew up in a place like Sigurd. These families were just struggling to stay alive, And I tell this story, people really don't quite understand it, but when I was a little kid and I went to the Christmas party, they handed out these sugar cookies. They were enormous. To my mind, they were about this big. But they were probably about like that, right? Probably made from lard rather than shortening, because that's what people had. And when I ate that cookie, I was filled with the love of God. I just felt it so strongly that I have never forgotten that. Even now, you know, if you ask me, why do I believe in God? I say, well, it's because of those sugar and it's sort of that humble, menial, maybe even grounded aspect of our faith that I really love. You know, I mean, certain people among us, I'm sure, are into theology, but I think our strength is not. If you're writing about your relationship with God, it's like writing about your dad, right? Are you writing a thesis, or are you writing a journal? I think we're writing journals.
I love that answer.
I often view this miraculous aspects of our faith as being postmodern. Right? And if modern is to say it's a scientific method, if you can't touch it and see it, it doesn't exist. If you can't measure it, it's not real. Right? If you can't apply some sort of universal taxonomy to it, then it doesn't matter. When you look at angels coming to the earth and communicating with men, and you look at miraculous translation that can't be explained in any sort of scientific manner, when you look at a teenage boy seeing God in Jesus Christ, those are not modern things, right? By any stretch. No one from the modern world would accept any of that, which is part of the problem that we have, right? Is that modern people can't accept that because it defies all their measures of identifying reality. So it can only be a postmodern view of your existence and religion.
Well, guess what? You know, I never thought that my intellectual life and my spiritual life would come to any kind of peace when I was younger. But in the world of academics today, guess what all the buzzwords are? Neo-animism, right? We're talking about neo-animism. We're talking about the new materiality. We're talking about the end of the secular period. You know, we're talking about the post-human, right? And these are all things that are really good for us. They are exactly what we believe in.
But we allowed ourselves to be held up to these modern critiques.
That's right.
And also actually embraced them and bought into that language.
That's right. We shouldn't have
now
done
we're
that.
seeing, this has to be, unless somebody has another question that just has to be asked, but maybe this is the last question. Do you see a new emerging spirituality among younger people that is more embodied and less modern?
Absolutely.
Because modernism turns out to be very sterile.
Modern is secular. Modern is the Enlightenment, right?
Yeah.
It was never good for us. It never was. But, you know, I went to Japan and I talked to a Shinto priest, and he said, I don't know what's happening, but we're getting a lot more younger people coming to the shrines now, right? And I think I can predict that, notice I'm using the word predict rather than prophesy. I can predict that we're going to see a great resurgence of religious and spiritual life. It's in the cards, unless the plug goes out, right? Unless the plug goes away and culture does not keep developing as it is developing, we're going to see a really interesting time when the kind of rationality that you talk about is not necessarily going to be leading all of our decisions.
I have an answer to Joseph's question. So Joseph was asking, where's the vitality if we can't tell this awesome story where we're the superheroes and we beat everybody else up? And when I think back to my mission in Taiwan, no one was ever converted by this story itself, because this story was actually kind of a weird story. Like, why would they want to care about this American person in this weird place seeing God? People in Taiwan see God all the time. I taught a Taoist priestess, and she's like, oh, yeah, let me tell you about the other day. You know. so no one on my mission was really converted by that story. What happened to them when people did get baptized, even people I saw who chose not to stay eventually, but what I saw in them is they experienced something in their heart. They felt something really powerful. And they had maybe come to it partly through the story, partly through the scriptures, partly through the warmth of the missionaries or the warmth of the members. But what actually was exciting to them was this tremendous experience. I remember one investigator who was really kind of a tough nut to crack. She was really, didn't seem interested at all in anything, but she just came to lessons. But then the day she was baptized, she was just laughing and just full of light that I could, sense. And for me, myself, it's also the same way. I haven't, convinced myself into any understanding of these theologies. I'm not as smart as Uncle Charles. I can't pronounce modernity or talk about the right definitions. And I can't do theology either because that's also way above my head. But, in my life, I've had these amazing, not that many, a couple, really phenomenal experiences where I knew that God was speaking to me. And that was within the context of my faith, this faith. And I think that's the most powerful thing. And my fear, I actually have an essay in the book. It's about charisma and organization and the tension between the two. And in all religious movements, there's this tension between people experiencing charisma, experiencing kind of grace or power, the gifts of God, and the kind of bureaucratic processes that set them up to do that, sometimes try to institutionalize it. But as we all know, it's really hard to regularize those fantastic, amazing spiritual experiences that we've had. They just come sometimes out of nowhere. So there's a balance between those two things, the charisma and the organization. I don't think you can have one without the other. Sometimes there's a danger that one overwhelms the other. But ultimately, I do feel like our faith is plenty charismatic, and that power is there in abundance, even without the story that we are the biggest superhero and we beat up everybody else.